close your eyes for a second. Not to imagine a vintage aesthetic, but to remember something deeper. The way a British house in winter smelled between the 1950s and the 1970s. Because you can forget dates. You can forget prices. You can forget the names of TV shows. But smell? Smell goes straight past your brain and into memory. And if you grew up in a British home before central heating became normal, winter had a scent profile so specific you could almost identify it with one breath at the front door. It wasn't one smell, it was a stack of smells. Warmth and damp, tea and laundry, smoke and soap, food and furniture polish, wet coats drying and cold air sneaking in around the frame of the door. So in this video, we're walking through a real winter day inside an ordinary British house of that era. Room by room, moment by moment, through the smells you'll never fully recreate. But you'll recognise instantly if you lived it. And as we go, remember, not every home was identical. Some were cleaner, some were poorer, some had different heating. But the core winter scents of Britain were shaped by the same realities: cold, damp, solid fuel or gas heating, small rooms, heavy fabrics, and routines built around surviving winter, not decorating it. Let's step inside. The first smell hits before you even see the living room. It's the hallway smell. A narrow space, usually cooler than the rest of the house and full of outside, brought in. Winter Britain had wet air, and the house collected it. So the hallway often smelled faintly of damp coats, wet wool and cold fabric. Sometimes you'd smell rainwater from umbrellas. Sometimes the faint rubbery smell of school shoes drying too slowly. Sometimes you'd smell a doormat that had absorbed 1,000 muddy footprints. And that's the first truth of old British winter homes. They weren't sealed. They breathed through drafts, gaps, old windows, which meant winter didn't stay outside. It sat in the doorway and waited. Now you step further in. And if the house had any kind of heating going, you'd smell the contrast: cold air in the hall, and warmth leaking from the living room like a promise. Because there was usually one warm room. That's where the real winter smell lived. You open the living room door and the atmosphere changes. The temperature rises a little, and with it comes the smell of the heat source. In many homes, especially earlier in the period, that smell meant coal, not just smoke. Coal has a specific dry, mineral smell, a heavy, slightly metallic scent that sits in fabrics and curtains. And it wasn't always pleasant, but it was familiar. It meant the fire was working. It meant the evening was going to be survivable. If you grew up around coal fires, you remember the smell in layers. The sharp moment when a new piece of coal hits heat. The smoky burst when something doesn't catch cleanly. The dusty smell when someone tends the grate. The faint ash smell that lingers even after the fire is low. And crucially, the smell didn't stay in the fireplace. It spread. It attached itself to curtains, to furniture, to clothes. It followed you into the next day. That's why older coats sometimes had that unmistakable winter scent, even when they were clean. Now, not every home used coal. Some homes had gas fires, especially later. And gas had its own winter smell, a warm, slightly dry smell in the air, often mixed with the scent of the room itself. It didn't mark everything the way coal did, but it still created a distinctive atmosphere. Warm air that felt local, focused around one spot. Because the heat didn't fill the house, it filled the zone around the heater, so even the smell of warmth was concentrated. Now, add the most British winter smell of all: tea. Tea wasn't optional. It wasn't a lifestyle. It was domestic infrastructure. And the smell of tea in an old British winter home wasn't just the brew itself. It was the full ritual. The kettle heating. Sometimes the faint metallic smell of the kettle. The steam. The tea leaves or tea bags. The warm scent rising as someone pours it. And because tea happened multiple times a day, it soaked into the memory of the house. If coal smell was the scent of heat, tea smell was the scent of comfort, and it mixed with other smells too: biscuits, toast, jam, maybe a little milk warming in a cup. For many people, the smell of tea in winter is what made the home feel like home. Then there was the smell that people rarely admit, but everyone remembers: damp. British winter damp isn't dramatic like a flood. It's quiet. It's the smell of moisture living in walls and fabrics because the house can't dry properly. In older homes, especially those with poor insulation or limited heating, damp could collect around window frames, behind wardrobes, in corners where air didn't move. And damp had a very specific smell: slightly sour, slightly stale, a cold smell. Not disgusting in every home, but present. That's why people fought it constantly with routines. Keep doors shut to protect heat, but open windows briefly for air. Dry laundry near the fire. Use airing cupboards if you had them. Move bedding, beat it, air it. Because damp wasn't just unpleasant, it made the house feel colder. A damp house chills you differently. Now let's talk about laundry, because laundry in winter was one of the main sources of house smell. Before tumble dryers were common, winter meant clothes drying indoors, on radiators if you had them, near the fire, on racks in the kitchen, over chairs, on lines in a back room, sometimes on a pulley area near the ceiling. And wet laundry has a smell that becomes part of winter memory. The clean detergent smell, yes, soap powder, warm cotton, fabric drying slowly. But also that slightly humid wet cloth smell that fills a room when nothing dries fast. In many houses, winter laundry scent became permanent. It wasn't unpleasant. It was domestic. It smelled like a household working. And if you grew up in it, it's weirdly comforting now, because it reminds you of being warm while the world outside was cold. Then there's the kitchen, the most honest room in the house. Winter kitchen smell in 1950s to 70s. Britain was rarely fresh. It was layered. First, toast. Toast was the universal quick food, especially after school, and it has a warm, slightly sweet smell that spreads fast. Then, fried food. Not constant, not in every home, but common enough. Bacon on weekends. Frying onions for stew, sausages, sometimes fish fingers, sometimes chips, sometimes leftovers being reheated. And because kitchens were smaller, smells stayed. Now add the smell of tinned food. People didn't talk about it as tinned food smell, but it existed. Beans, soup, meat pies, fruit, evaporated milk in some households. Things heated quickly to keep you going. And in winter, those smells were stronger because the house was closed up. Windows shut, doors shut, heat protected. So the kitchen smell became the whole house smell, especially in a small terrace. If you grew up in one of those houses, you know it. You could tell what was for tea the moment you opened the front door. Now, go back to the living room, because winter living rooms had another scent people remember. Furniture polish. Not always, but often. That lemony, slightly chemical, slightly sweet smell of wood polish on sideboards and tables. On Sunday afternoons especially, many homes cleaned and polished. And in winter, that polish smell mixed with warmth and smoke and tea. It created the scent of a room that was being kept nice. A sense of respectability. Even if money was tight, many families still believed in keeping the room presentable, and smell played a role in that. A clean, polished room smelled like pride. Now let's talk about something that hits people hard. The smell of the one warm room itself. When a family spends most winter evenings in one room, that room becomes a concentrated human environment. It smells of bodies, fabric, warmth, and time. Wool jumpers drying on chairs, blankets, carpet, a dog if the family had one, smoke if the house had it, and the faint smell of a heater working. It wasn't sterile, it felt lived in, and that's why people remember it as cosy, even if objectively the house wasn't that warm. Because coziness isn't only heat, its concentration. Then there's the bedroom smell. And this one is strange, because bedrooms in older British houses could be colder, and cold changes smell. Cold makes fabrics smell sharper. Cold makes air feel cleaner but harsher. Cold makes blankets hold on to scent, so bedroom winter smell often included clean sheets, sometimes with that crisp laundry smell. Hot water bottles. Rubbery, warm, slightly metallic sometimes if the water was very hot. Maybe the faint scent of talcum powder if the household used it. And the quiet smell of cold air that had been trapped all day. You'd climb into bed and the bed had its own smell. Warm fabric. Your own breath. A faint whiff of soap. Sometimes the smoky trace that followed you upstairs from the living room. And if you remember it, you remember the sensation too. Cold room, warm bed. A kind of relief that feels almost physical. Now, there are a few minor smells that were everywhere and are hard to explain to people who didn't live it. One is wet newspaper. Newspapers were everywhere, on tables, by chairs, under cups. And paper has a smell, especially when it's slightly damp from winter air or near a heater. Another is cigarette smoke. In many homes of the era, smoking indoors was normal, so the smell could be present in the background, in curtains, in upholstery, in the general air. It's not a smell everyone misses, but it's a smell many associate with grandparents, with certain living rooms, with a specific kind of adult world. Another is boots and shoes, leather, polish, wet rubber soles, school shoes drying, that slightly sweaty winter shoe smell in a hallway. These weren't dramatic, they were constant, and that's what makes them powerful. So what happened to all these smells? A lot of them faded for one reason. Modern homes are warmer, drier, and more sealed. Central heating warms the whole house. Double glazing reduces drafts. Better insulation reduces cold surfaces. Tumble dryers reduce indoor laundry smell. Open-plan living changes how smells travel. Smoking indoors became far less common. The modern house has fewer shared smells because it's less concentrated, and that's good for comfort. But it also changes memory, because those old winter scents weren't just odours. They were signs that life was happening, the house working, the family coping, the season being managed. That's why one small smell, like coal smoke on a coat, or tea brewing, or laundry drying near heat, can hit someone like a wave, because it isn't just smell. It's a whole room, a whole evening, a whole childhood winter. If you grew up in a British house in winter between the 1950s and 70s, you didn't just remember what you saw, you remember what you breathed. Coal or gas warmth, tea on repeat, damp in the corners, laundry drying slowly, toast, stew, and winter kitchens, furniture polish on a Sunday, wet coats in the hallway, and that one warm room where life gathered because warmth was limited. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and if you remember it, you probably felt something just hearing it described.